So for chapter 4, chapter 6, key issue 4, we're going to go over territorial conflicts between different religious groups. And so we'll talk about some of the religious conflicts arising from government policies. We can summarize reasons for conflicts between religions. And we're going to look at the reasons for religious conflicts in part of the Middle East. And a lot of the conflicts that we need to go over will be continued on in chapter 7. So when we have, why do we have religious conflicts within territories? Because there's often conflict between religion or religious policies versus government policies. And so religious groups may oppose policies that are seen to contradict their religious values. So because religion is one element of cultural diversity, it means that the more diversity we have, which is a good thing, the harder it is to involve government in these policies. And religion is probably the one cultural element that has led to the most conflict globally. Traditionally, when you look at religious conflict in areas, you can tie the roots to religious fundamentalism. Fundamentalism can be from any branch of a religion. It can be from any religious family or grouping. And it's when you take a literal interpretation of whatever holy text or scripture you have and use a strict adherence to the basic principles of a religion. So fundamentalism across all religions has led to more conflict than any other cultural practice. So when we talk about fundamentalism and conflict, the first thing that you might think of is groups like the Taliban or Islamic fundamentalist terrorism. So the Taliban's control of the Afghanistan's government in the 90s led to the government adopting, strict religious laws that oppose Western values. And so there were Western non-Islamic activities that were banned. So soccer stadiums were converted to settings for executions and floggings because soccer is a Western sport and you shouldn't be enjoying it anymore. But keep in mind that Islam is not the only faith that has fundamentalist groups. And fundamentalist groups have created conflict and terror across all religions. The conflicts for religion are most likely to occur when you have two religious groups faith at a boundary together. So in Ireland, there were a lot of religious wars, and they've really settled down now. But when I grew up in the 80s, there were still lots of bombings throughout Ireland. So if you look at the history of Ireland, in 1937, Ireland became independent from the United Kingdom. About 46% of Ireland was Protestant and about 40% was Roman Catholic. Because Ireland had been under the United Kingdom's control for so long, and the United Kingdom was a Protestant nation, like the Church of England is a Protestant nation. If you remember your history, remember that Henry VIII established the Church of England and broke away from the Catholic Church. His daughter Mary briefly embraced the Catholic Church again because she was married to the King of Spain. And during her brief rule, she had, Protestants executed so many that they called her Bloody Mary. And then when Elizabeth took the throne again, she converted England back to a Protestant nation. And so since Elizabeth, really, since Queen Elizabeth I, the United Kingdom, or Great Britain at the time, was a predominantly Protestant nation. This meant that the Roman Catholics that were still practicing in Ireland were victimized by discriminatory practices, whether it was loss of land, general social discrimination. And then as you moved into the 20th century, you had exclusion from higher paying jobs, exclusion from better schools and colleges. And because of this long-rooted conflict between the Church of England or other Protestant groups and the Catholic Church in the United Kingdom and Ireland, you have cities like Belfast that's highly segregated between its Roman Catholics and its Protestants. So in about 1968, when we had our civil rights movement here in the United States, and we've talked about how, in Wales, they had, their own marches to make sure they could still speak Welsh. In the United Kingdom, we also had protests by Roman Catholics. And these protests ended up with blood being shed between both Protestants and Roman Catholics. So the protest initiated in 1968, but they quickly erupted into violence. So if you look at the United Kingdom and Ireland here, you can see that part of the northern part of Ireland chose to remain within the United Kingdom when Ireland got its independence in 1937. And the Republic of Ireland, the rest of the southern part of Ireland, stayed independent. You can also see that the northern part of Ireland, the part that's staying associated with the United Kingdom, is predominantly Protestant, and the southern part of Ireland is predominantly Catholic. If you look in the city of Belfast a little closer, so if we look at the larger scale, so we zoom in, you can see that there are sharp divisions within the city. And so there are areas over in the northwestern part of Belfast that are primarily Catholic. And then there are areas in the eastern part of Belfast that are primarily Protestant. So when I grew up, there were bombings. There were groups like the IRA, and there was a lot of conflict. And so I think we have a short memory sometimes. I remember a musician protesting the conflict in Ireland by tearing up a picture of the Pope. I remember her name was Sinead O'Connor. I remember bombings. There were music groups, so if you listen to some of the older music from U2, or if you've heard of the Cranberries, they reflect a lot of this conflict in their music. And right now we're at kind of a peaceful transition, and we want to hopefully that it stays that way. In the Middle East, so when I talk about religious conflict, you probably thought of the Middle East right away. The religious conflict in the Middle East is some of the longest standing in the world. And so we have a battle about ongoing fight for 2,000 years to control really the small strip of land in the Eastern Mediterranean. And so in Judaism, they have a special claim to this territory. It's called the Promised Land. It's the land that was promised to them by God. And this is where major events in the development of their religion occurred. Islam, the Muslim army conquered the small strip of land in the 7th century AD. Jerusalem is the third holiest city to Muslims because it's where Muhammad ascended into heaven. So you've got the most holy city is Mecca, where Muhammad was born. The second most holy city is Medina, where Muhammad is buried, and Jerusalem, where Muhammad is ascended into heaven. And then in Christianity, the Holy Land in Jerusalem is considered the holy city because of the major events in Jesus' life, death, and resurrection that occurred there. So after World War II, the UN created essentially a Jewish state, Israel. So we created a homeland for people of the Jewish faith, which was, at the time, certainly really needed. The world was still in shock from the Holocaust, and so we created a Jewish state so people would have essentially a safe place to go. The Jewish people had been persecuted across Europe, and so now they had their own homeland. And the only problem with this idea, because it's a great idea, is that people already lived there. So we gave the Holy Land back to the Jewish people, but the people who lived there, weren't happy about it. So in 1947, here's a partition plan. So all these areas here in pink are the Jewish state, and these areas in green are Arab Muslim states. And a lot of these areas are still conflicted now. So right here, the Gaza Strip is still in conflict, and over here, the West Bank is still in conflict. Now, the Jerusalem district itself is kept as an international city because there's so many faiths that spring from there. About a year after the UN partitioned Israel and created a Jewish state, they had the 1948 and 1949 war. And at the end of that war, you can see that here is the areas that are partitioned for Israel. And these are the areas that are now controlled by Jordan. So there was a war between essentially the Palestinians and Israel. The Gaza Strip was conquered then by Israel. But everything up to Jerusalem, the international district, was held by Jordan. So Israel lost some territory, but gained some territory up here by Lebanon and parts of Syria. This is what the Middle East has looked like essentially since the 1967 war. So these areas here are occupied by Israel, but not technically part of the Jewish state. So you've got parts of bordering in Syria here, occupied by Israel, the West Bank, which is occupied by Israel, but it's also occupied by Palestinians. So you've got some Palestinian control in the West Bank, and this is an area of conflict. So if you watch the news or listen to the news, you'll hear about, like bombings and attacks here in the West Bank. And then here in the Gaza Strip, this is an area that's been captured by Israel ever since 1948, but is under some Palestinian control. This part here was captured by Israel, but then was returned to Egypt. And then you have, this is the actual, sovereign state of Israel. And then you still have the city of Jerusalem. So all of this conflict right now, primarily between the Israel state or the Jewish state and the Islamic Arab nations around it, has led to, not just a huge amount of wars within the country, but your status, like what you think should be done about this part of land, really dictates policy throughout the Middle East. So often, if you support Israel, other nations will use that as a way to stir up divisiveness against your country. So, like the U.S. supports Israel. So many nations in the Middle East use that as a way to drive conflict between the U.S. or other European nations and other Islamic nations in the Middle East. So this small little part of land here has led to most of the religious world conflict we see in the Middle East today. After the 1973 war, the Palestinians ended up emerging as Israel's primarily opponent because they view themselves as the legitimate rulers of Israel. And I'm not even sure how to establish peace in the Middle East, but I know that it would start with that small strip of land. And if one religion has political control over Jerusalem, I don't know if peace is ever possible, at least not in the Middle East. So the status of Jerusalem is essential when we look at ending religious conflict in the Middle East. And if you see, here's the actual city of Jerusalem. And so you can see all the different areas that are marked off as sacred territory. And so you have it divided into quarters. So you have a Christian quarter, a Muslim quarter, a Jewish quarter, and an Armenian quarter. You can see here you've got mosques and museums, you've got synagogues. Here you have the Al-Haram al-Sharif, which is built over one of the most holy or sacred Jewish sites, the Dome of the Rock. You've got old churches, so you've got the Armenian Catholic Church. You've got right here the Stations of the Cross, so this is where Jesus would have walked on his route to his crucifixion. You've got holy sites all over the place. You've got Herod's Gate. You might have heard about Temple Gate. And so if you practice a religion, you might have heard of some of these sites before. And so you've got this area that's sacred to 3 different religions and people fighting over the territories. So in summary, the world has 3 large universalizing religions: Christianity, Islam, and Buddhism, each of which is divided into branches and denominations. A universalizing religion has a known origin and clear patterns of diffusions, where ethnic religions have unknown origins and little diffusion. Holy places and holidays in a universalizing religion are related to the events in the life of its founder or prophet. And ethnic religions, they are related to the physical geography. And within the Earth surface, with the Earth surface